the Kansas Master Naturalist, what they want you to learn would take about a year. So what we're going to try to do today is get you some of the basics about why insects are so successful. What is it about their biology, their body plan? What are they actually doing out there? And the remote doesn't seem to work, so I'm going to have to walk around. Uh-oh. Uh-oh, Jill. It doesn't want to advance. Okay, you hit the pad?
Yes.
Okay. So what we'll talk about today is just basically what is entomology. It's a huge science. Who are the insects related to? Because if they're such a huge group, I want to sort of frame them in the context of the animal world. You got two people in the waiting room. Why are they so successful? What do they perceive? Boy, if I could be an insect for an hour, that would be awesome because they're sensing and perceiving so many things that we don't. What are they really doing? And how do you go out and collect them? And I've built in 2 breaks. So we'll yak for a while. We'll take a break. We'll yak for a while. We'll take a break. And then we'll finish up. And if anyone has any questions, please do. Just shout at me. Throw something at me. So, entomology. What is it? Basically, it's just the study of insects. But it's such a huge and diverse field. It encompasses everything from basic molecular studies of the genomes, excuse me, of insects, to very, very applied entomology. So when you think about production, agriculture, or cattle raising, and things like that, half of our department actually doesn't have an entomology degree. We have microbiologists, we have people with animal health backgrounds. So you don't have to actually have an entomology degree to be an entomologist. So if you learn nothing else today, learn this. Most animals on the planet are insects. I tell this to every class I teach, no matter if they're freshmen or grad students. No matter what animal you're talking about, most of the animals on this planet are insects. That's both for number of species and number of individuals. Are you guys actually writing notes down? Oh, good. It's all on the slides. Listen to me. Don't write down every word. So, in the broader context, arthropods, insects are arthropods. Arthropods make up 75% of all the animal species on the planet. So when you think about what an arthropod is, they're basically the things that have exoskeletons. They're crunchy when you step on them, and they have jointed legs. So 75% of the animals on the planet are arthropods, and most of the arthropods are insects. So how many species of insects are there? Right now, there's about 1.5 million described species. And when I say described, that means they're known to science. Someone's looked at them, studied them, and said, oh, this is a species. There are an unknown million number of species still out there that we don't know about. There are about 142,000 non-insect arthropods. And this is what's called a speciescape. So this represents all the life on Earth, scaled in proportion to the number of species that there are. So naturally, who is dominating the landscape? The insects. So the mantid represents all the species of insects. The scorpion represents all the other arthropods. So collectively, this is most of the animal life on the planet. If you look at things like fishes, yeah, okay, there's fish. The annelids, the fungi, the birds, that's how many species there are in relation to everything else. And of course, here we are. We are the mammals, represented by the little bison on the prairie. So if you look at things with backbones, there's about 43,000 chordates out there, about 250,000 vascular plants. So there's a lot of insects out there. There's a lot of non-insect arthropods out there. So I'm just going to run through these really quickly because I get asked about these a lot. These are just the other arthropods that you commonly encounter when you're out walking around. The centipedes, the class Calopida, don't worry about these names. Not a huge group. There's about 2,600 species of centipedes, and these are daytime predators. They actually have a modified front leg. These are sometimes called jaws, but this is just a modified front leg that has evolved so the claw is hollow and it acts as a fang, and they have venom glands. So this is the last thing a centipede meal sees when it runs up and grabs it with these front legs and injects it with a venom. So nocturnal hunters. But notice exoskeleton, crunchy on the outside, and jointed legs, the hallmark.
I've got a quick question before you leave this.
Yeah.
And it's a nerdy question. Are those cubipeds?
I've heard them called toxognats, like toxic gnat for a jaw.
Gotcha.
I think you could probably find 3 different terms depending on what textbook you open up. The millipedes.
If one of those bites you, will leave a wart though?
They will bite. I don't know if I can back up on this. Yeah. So these are common in houses, house centipedes. These are really fast. If you have these, you shouldn't have insects in your house. They're taking care of them. Yeah, these will bite. The guy that used to run our insect zoo on campus, he was bitten by one of these big ones, and it bit him on the hand, and he said it numbed him up to the elbow. So, yeah, I mean, just the size of that penetrating your skin, that'd be like driving, a nail into your flesh. So forget about the venom, just the physical thing undoubtedly hurt. And they're really aggressive predators. They'll take on mice and small vertebrates even. The millipedes, pretty big group, 10,000 species. I call these sort of the gentle grazers of the arthropod world. They're scavengers, they're nocturnal. They'll come out at night and graze on plant material or decaying plant material. Very, very gentle. But once again, hard exoskeleton, a lot of jointed legs. Oops. The crustaceans. I still use the word crustacean. The new term is Malaise, which I hate. But you're familiar with these. Crab, shrimp, lobster, crayfish, arthropods, things like that. Very large group. 50,000 species in there. These are arthropods. These are cousins to the insects. So how many people like to eat crab, shrimp, and lobster? Yeah. You're basically eating a big aquatic grasshopper, is what it comes down to. And when I talk about insects, humans using insects as food in class, all the world eats insects except North America. And I talk about cultural changes in cuisine. In colonial days, lobsters were trash food. Only the poor people ate lobster. And that was actually fed to people in prisons and jails. And look what the price of lobster is today. So cultural cuisines change. All right, advance. Why are you not advancing? Jill, I'm stuck.
You got it on the control screen somehow.
I got your screen. You're okay.
And somehow I missed, I somehow skipped over arachnids. This is my other favorite group, arachnids. Huge group, 80,000 species. So these are spiders, ticks, scorpions, mites, harvestmen, weird things like whip scorpions. Once again, arthropods. So just like the insects and the other groups we looked at, they have an exoskeleton. Their exoskeletons on the outside, and they have jointed legs. A lot of different biologies in the arachnids. So you have a lot of predators, you have herbivorous mites, you have predatory mites. If you've ever been attacked by chiggers, this is what chiggers grow up to be. And of course, we're all familiar with everyone's favorite ticks, which is one nice reason to burn Konza, because you know you're going to kill a lot of ticks.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
I'm a terrible etymology nerd. Malacostraca, what are those? I mean, mala, I'm assuming is bad, but
No, I don't think it's bad. I can tell you what all the insect orders are, and I have a Greek and Latin dictionary in my office to look up stuff like that. But if Jim will make a note of your
I just
question.
didn't know what that meant because I taught it.
Yeah,
I can also look it up.
yeah.
You don't have to make up for my laziness.
And the insects. So we'll talk about insects the rest of the time. As I said, approximately 1.5 million species, and we have no idea how many species are actually out there. But if you look at the insects as a group, there's about 31 orders of insects. So this is the class. So if you remember your taxonomic scale. Orders are groups of related insects. So all the beetles are one order. All the grasshoppers and crickets and katydids, they're an order of insects. All the ants, the bees, and the wasps, that's an order. So that's a very large, convenient grouping of closely related things. So there's about 31 different orders, depending on what book you look at. Huge class. And of course, you learn this in elementary school. 3 body regions: a head, a thorax that has legs and wings, and then an abdomen. Everyone knows that. There are always exceptions to the rule in biology, though. There are actually the modern ants, bees, and wasps actually have 4 parts to their thorax. Most insects have 3 parts to the thorax. So there's always exceptions in biology. Typically 1 pair of antennae, like you see on this beetle, 3 pairs of legs, and usually 2 pairs of wings. Once again, there are always exceptions. There are legless insects. There are wingless insects. There are insects with only 1 wing, 1 pair of wings. There are insects that only have a front pair. There are insects that only have a back pair. So once you're dealing with biological systems, there's always going to be exceptions to the rules.
Would you call those mutations?
No, not. Maybe they popped up in evolutionary history as a mutation, depending on what developmental gene was turned on or turned off or altered. But since you bring that up, you can go in and screw around with the regulatory genes that control the body regions or body parts, and you can actually make a wasp have legs instead of antennae, because antennae are derived from legs evolutionarily. So you can actually go in and twiddle with the regulatory genes, and you can have a wasp with 2 legs sticking on the front of its head instead of antennae. So who's dominating the insects out of these 1.5 million species? If you look at this pie chart of all the insects, you see that 4 groups really dominate the insect world. So if you look at this little slice of the pie, you see things like dragonflies and damselflies and the grasshoppers and the true bugs, things like stink bugs and aphids and cicadas. But you see this big green slice of the pie is dominated by the 4, what I call mega diverse orders of insects. The Lepidoptera, these are the butterflies and the moths. There are about 150,000 species known. The Diptera, the flies, these are all flies, mosquitoes, midges. About 120,000 species. Hymenoptera, so these are the ants, the bees, and the wasps. Once again, about 120,000 species. Beetles dominate. There are over 300,000 species of beetles that are known, that are scientifically described, and more are found every day. There's a famous quote, I believe it was by J.B.S. Haldane. Someone asked him why there were so many species of beetles, and his quote was, "God had an inordinate fondness for beetles." You find that in every biology textbook. So although there are a ton of insect species, really 4 groups dominate the number of species that are out there. And I put this up here as an example, just how common undescribed species are. So this is an online publication called Zokeys. I think I took a screen grab of this in 2017. This is an online publication designed for taxonomists and systematists to get their information out there. And this was just a table of contents. 4 new species of moth. 5 new species of a fly, 2 new species of a neuropteran, a new genus and a new species of a hopper. And I did this one just a couple weeks ago. So this is the end of February. This is a similar publication, Zootaxa. 4 new species of a scarab beetle, a new species of black insect, that's like a scale, a new genus and a new species of a weevil, 4 new species of a fly, 6 new species of a moth. New species or undescribed species that people encounter and describe, dirt common. We've described new species from Konza. We've described new species from the Flint Hills. Yeah.
And I was gonna add, it's not an insect, but we have a spider down in Kings Creek that I've not been able to find described anywhere.
Really?
Yeah, it's black with red spots.
What family? You know?
I don't have a clue.
Yeah. So there certainly deserves to be a lot of attention drawn to places like the tropics, but we really have no idea what's in our own backyard. There was the LA County Museum, there's a dipterist there. He got a lot of citizen science going. He described like 20-something species of fly just from the Los Angeles neighborhoods. You know, they've been there all the time, but no one was out looking for them, and they didn't know they were there. So, new species of insects are dirt common. So this is just random factoids you can get out of any textbook. The estimated ratio of insects to humans, 200 million to 1. So for every person on the planet, there's an estimated 200 million insects. That's a lot of mouths out there to feed and a lot of effects on ecological systems. An estimated 400 million insects per acre. That's a lot of flesh, a lot of biomass. This is just a slide of a locust swarm. Locust swarms occur in the Middle East and North Africa fairly frequently. You can have 28 billion locusts in a swarm. These are basically migratory grasshoppers. These swarms can be 10, 15, 20 miles long, and they can eat tons of vegetation every day. If you've ever been around water when mayflies are swarming, they can pile up in huge, huge numbers. This is a bridge in South Carolina. They actually had to close the bridge because there were so many mayflies and cars running over them, you know, getting slippery and crashing. They actually had to close this bridge. These are just piles of mayflies. So they can occur in very, very, very large numbers at different times. This is the year for, if you know cicadas, what cicada is, this is the year for group 10 to emerge in several states. And cicadas spend their many years underground as nymphs feeding on roots. And then they all emerge simultaneously or very close, a very short interval of time in different regions of the country. And each region has its own brood. Hang on a second. So brood 10 will emerge over a number of states, and there'll be a lot of attention in the media. And literally, you can have 100 of these coming out per square foot in a given area. Kirk?
Has climate change affected their emergence?
Not that I'm aware of, and I would expect they're probably pretty insulated from climate change because they're underground. So they spend, I think the shortest cicada life cycle is 4 years, but we're talking, 13 and 17 years for these guys, these periodical cicadas. Climate is definitely affecting a lot of other insects, and we'll talk about that near the end. More random factoids. I love to play Trivial Pursuit. Birds. So if you look at the animal biomass, that's just the amount of living animal tissue out there. In temperate zones, there's about 1 pound of bird per acre. Insects, about 400 pounds per acre. So if you took all the insects in an acre in temperate areas like this, smashed them out with a cartoon steamroller, you would have about 400 pounds per acre. In the tropics, you have about a ton of insects per acre. I think for humans, it's in temperate zones, it's about 14 pounds of people per acre. So you can see the ratio of animal mass out there compared to humans, to things like birds, to things like insects. They've done surveys. This is pretty telling. These are called springtails, Columbola. They've sampled 100 million of these in a square meter on an Iowa farm. So they're very, very small, but in very large numbers, they're having different types of ecological effects on the environment. This will be on the exam at the end of today, so make sure you memorize this. I think I've memorized the geological chart probably 3 times when I was an undergraduate. And as soon as the exam was over, I immediately forgot everything. But all I want you to do, get out of this, is insects have been here for a very, very, very long time. They're about 400 million years old. So if we look at our time scale on the geologic timetable, this is 400 million years ago. Here's 300 million years ago. And the first fossil insects show up at about 400 million years. So they've been here a really, really, really long time. And if you look at this phylogeny or branching diagram of insects, it didn't take long for them to evolve wings. So this is a major advance in the evolution of insects, the formation of wings. And it didn't take very long after that. This was another major advance where insects could fold their wings backward. So if you think about a dragonfly or damselfly, they have primitive wings. So when they're not flying, their wings are out like this. They can't fold them up over their back. So this sort of limits where they can get. So if you're a dragonfly, you're not crawling through tall grass because you got these big clunky wings in the way. So the next big advance after wings was the ability to fold the wings back over the abdomen. It was a more modern hinge between the wing and the body. So when you think about a grasshopper or a fly, they can fold their wings back over the body like this and store them out of the way. If you've ever seen a helicopter on an aircraft carrier, they fold their rotors up behind them to save space. And this opens up a lot more habitat and niches on the ground or in the water for the insects. And then the next big advance was insects that have a complete life cycle, or the holometabolous life cycle. So you learn this in school. You have an incomplete metamorphosis and complete metamorphosis. The holometabolous insects, they have an egg, they have their larval stages, they have a pupa, which transforms into the adult. And most of the insects in number, the flies, the beetles, the butterflies, and the ants, bees, and the wasps have this type of life cycle. So some big major evolutionary steps. They've been around 400 million years. And a lot of the insect groups have been around, they're older than the dinosaurs. So here's the age of dinosaurs. And you really can't see this, and I hate it when people say, I know you can't see this, but these are things like flies and beetles and ants and bees. They've been around for a long, long, long time, over 200 million years. So insects are very, very old. There are also a lot of groups that evolved. We have fossils for them. They went extinct. They just didn't make it.
So what was, there looks like a lot of them went extinct at the same time around the Permian time there.
Don't know. That's a geology question. But speaking of fossils, there is a very famous insect fossil site at Elmo, Kansas. Who knows where Elmo, Kansas is? The old guy. Sorry. I'm old too. I'm old.
3 houses in Elmo.
Yeah. So where is Elmo, Mike?
It's in Dickinson County.
South of it.
Yeah, it's about an hour southwest of here. You drive by, you don't even see it. So, but there are very famous fossils, insect fossils, from Elmo, Kansas. There's also a very famous insect fossil site in Florissant, Colorado. This is Frank Carpenter. He's a very famous Harvard insect paleontologist working at Elmo. And something, of course, limestone makes good fossils. This is an 11-inch long dragonfly wing. So this dragonfly wing is about that long. It was found in Elmo in 1939. This is Floyd Holmes. He was a graduate student in our department in 1939. And here he is posing with the insect wing that he found. So half of we have the wing in our K-State Insect Zoo. The other half of the wing is at Harvard. So just imagine dragonflies with a wingspan like this flying around Kansas at some point in history.
Yeah, but we know 250, 300 million years ago, we know that this was down 10 degrees north of the equator.
Right.
And it was a lot more tropical.
Yes.
And we were in Pangea.
Yes. There are tsetse flies known from Colorado, which of course you would never find today. Yeah, things have definitely changed. So the point of all of this little preliminary bit is insects are hugely successful as a group. And when I say successful as a group, I'm basing that on 3 criteria. The number of species there are. There are more species of insects than anything else, than any other animal in the world. Number of individuals. So the 200 million insects per human. What's our human population? 5.5 billion? Something like that?
Or 7 billion.
7 billion, okay. Yeah, so multiply 7 billion by 200 million. And they're successful based on their geological age. They preceded the dinosaurs. They've been here for a very, very, very long time. So when you look at these measures of success, how many species, how many individuals, how long they've been around, they're obviously very, very successful, which of course begs the question, why? Why are they successful? What is it about this insect body or this body plan of what they do? What is it about those that makes them such a successful group? They're little. For the most part, they're very, very small in size compared to most other animals. They don't require a lot of energy. They have often very low nutrient needs. So this is a slide. This is a little parasitic wasp. This is a multicellular animal. This is a paramecium. This is an amoeba. These are sized to scale. So this multicellular wasp, it lays its eggs in moth and butterfly eggs, is smaller than some one-celled animals. Here are 3 parasitic wasps on a dime. So those are multicellular, perfectly good insects. Head, thorax, abdomen, wings, antenna. But you can see they're very small. This is another parasitic wasp. I'm very fond of parasitic wasps. This is a millimeter ruler. So this is 1 millimeter. So this wasp is about 1 millimeter in size. So small size means you don't need a lot of energy. You can get into a lot of very, very small habitats. You can disperse very easily. Many of these are blown around on the wind. There's like aerial plankton blowing around out there. They have collected insects on top of Mount Everest floating in the air currents, and 29,900 feet above sea level. So they're floating around out there. Many of them are too small for us to even see without catching them and using a microscope. So very dispersible. So essentially they can put more energy into reproducing and making more insects instead of taking time to grow a large body and feed a lot of muscles and a lot of body tissues. So small size, short generation time. They typically reproduce fast. So many insects have a very fast population growth, which means they can adapt and evolve pretty rapidly. Of course, evolution occurs every time with each generation. So every time something reproduces, it's literally evolving. There's slight genetic changes if it's sexual reproduction. So if you look at this bison, when you think about most vertebrates, so think about birds, lizards, mammals, typically slow growth, slow reproduction, slow generation time. So when a bison is born, how long before they reproduce? Tom, Jill, 2 years. All right. So this guy's going to have to hang around and feed for 2 years before it starts to reproduce. Look at other things like elephants with very long lives that are slow to reproduce. Look at humans, typically very, very slow reproduction. So very slow growth, very slow reproduction, slow generation time. A lot of insects have a 1-year life cycle. And once again, there's always exceptions. Some insects have a 4-year life cycle, a 10-year life cycle. But a lot of the insects that we encounter have a 1-year life cycle. It's one generation per year. So right now, there's a bunch of grasshopper eggs out there in the prairie waiting to hatch. They were laid late last summer or early fall. Those will hatch, the nymphs will feed and develop. Sometime in the summer, they'll reach adulthood, they'll reproduce, they'll lay their eggs and die off. So one generation a year. But they're still reproducing at a much faster rate than very large vertebrates. Then you have things like flies and a lot of other insects that might have a 10-day or a 2-week life cycle. So this fly could lay an egg, the egg hatches, the larva feeds, it develops, it pupates, it's a new adult, 10 to 14 days. So that means you can have very rapid growth in populations, very rapid reproduction, very, very fast generation time. So, yeah.
I was just gonna tell you, I saw a fly like 2 days after the super cold polar vortex day. I had a fly like flying into my window.
Oh yeah, yeah. Moths are already out. My technician's been collecting for a month. Yeah, so yeah, they're out there. They're ready to pop out. Yeah, Ken.
So if they're growing that fast, there must be a lot of chemical reactions going on there. Do they generate a lot of heat for their size?
No, they're cold-blooded. So their metabolism is dependent on temperature. So typically, if it's cold, like flies outside, like say there are flies on a deer carcass. If summertime, it's hot, they're going to develop fast. If it's late fall and they're on a deer carcass and it's cooler, their life cycle will slow down. So it's very temperature dependent. And actually, I'll throw in forensic entomology. They can use that in forensic entomology. So if they find like a dead body, so, you know, someone gets mad, they dump a body out in the woods or out on the prairie, they can go in, investigators can look at the insects that are on that body, and based on the temperature for the past several days and the life stages, is it an egg, is it an early larva, a middle larva, a late larva, is it a pupa, they can backtrack, and they know for different species of things like flies, how long each developmental stage is. So they can ascertain when that corpse became a corpse and a food resource for insects. So, but it's all driven by temperature. So they run experiments with different temperature regimes and corpses to see how fast these different species develop. So if you take like a dragonfly nymph that's in water, if it's a really, really cold year or a cool year, it will develop more slowly. If it's a hot year, it will develop faster. So yeah, temperature drives the metabolic rate of insects. So flies, if you have a 10 to 14 day life cycle, you can literally go through thousands of generations compared to even a grasshopper that reproduces once a year, or a large vertebrate that might, you know, take several years to become reproductive, and then may only have 1 or 2 or 5 offspring per year. You have a fly that lays 100 eggs at a time, and it does this every 2 weeks. So you can see populations can build very, very quickly. And really what that means is these are evolving faster. Because every time you reproduce sexually, you're evolving, you're changing gene frequencies and stuff like that. So they can evolve faster. When DDT, for us upper middle-aged people, when DDT was very popular as an insecticide, it came into common use in the late World War II. In just a few years after that, the first houseflies were found to be resistant to DDT in the early 1950s. So in just a few years after DDT was exposed to insects had evolved resistance to it. So they can evolve very, very quickly.
We had DDT days at school where they would spray everybody with powder to kill all the fleas and everything people had.
When I was living in Japan, in Tokyo on an Air Force base, the DDT trucks would drive by fogging. And we would run through the clouds of DDT, and we thought that was great. And it hasn't bothered me a bit. not a bit. Speaking of DDT, since this is entomology, you all have DDT residues in your body. DDT was banned, I think, in 1972 in this country. But it's a very, very stable hydrocarbon, and its metabolites persist in the environment. And even though it hasn't been used in this country for years, everyone in here has some trace of DDT in their bodies. Not to scare you. So the other big reason, and I alluded to this earlier, that insects are so successful, is metamorphosis. So things like grasshoppers, they hatch. They basically look like a little tiny adult grasshopper. You can look at a newly hatched grasshopper and you can tell it's a grasshopper. It's just a small version of the adult. And it feeds and it grows, it molts, it sheds its exoskeleton, and eventually it develops reproductive glands and wings and starts reproducing. But the big four, the beetles, the ants, the bees, the wasps, the flies, and the butterflies and moths, have a different life cycle. That's called whole metabolism. Don't worry about that word. But it's pretty much a division of labor in the life stages as it grows and develops. So you have a resistant stage as the egg. This is a complete package. Everything the insect needs, the embryo needs to grow and develop in this package. It's resistant to chemicals. It's resistant to weather, depending on the species. It will hatch. And in this case, it's a caterpillar. Every time you look at the caterpillar, what's it doing?
Eating.
It's eating. That is the job of the larva. Eat. Eat, store energy. Eat, store energy. So this will molt a couple of times. It'll shed its exoskeleton a few times. And eventually, when it has enough energy reserve, it'll enter the pupal stage. And this is a massive reorganization stage. Literally, it's digesting itself. It's breaking down a lot of the larval tissues, and it's using those to form new structures. So you don't see wings, you don't see long legs. It's got some little tiny antenna, but it's basically reorganizing the body. And this is what you get, the adult. This is the reproductive mobile stage. So you have this nice division of labor for the different life stages, and each stage has a different job.
So I was wondering about the pupa stage.
Mm-hmm.
There must be cells that persist from larva to pupa that are not being digested. Or does every cell just kind of stop expressing its genes the way it had?
Okay, that's a great question. So what's present in the larva are actually, the adult cells are there. They're just not turned on and activated. These are called imaginal discs. Imago is just the $10 word for adult. So there's a group of cells that are going to form the wings. There's a group of cells that are going to form the reproductive organs. There's a group of cells that are going to form different structures in the body. And those, as this breaks down tissues that aren't needed, then those cells get turned on and it will develop, those will grow into the wings, into the long antenna. You can lose things too, we'll talk about this. So these have a complete set of mouth parts. This is just a simple soda straw. It's lost most of its larval mouth parts. But it is a huge, massive reorganization. And all of these stages are all controlled by different hormones, which I won't get into. But there are certain hormones that tell this caterpillar, if this hormone level is the right level, okay, molt into the next bigger caterpillar, and then molt into the next bigger caterpillar. And then when that level drops, it will say, okay, molt to form the pupa. So there's a great interplay of different hormones that control all of this development. Good question. And then lastly, exoskeleton, almost lastly, exoskeleton. This is great stuff. So all the arthropods have exoskeleton. That's just exoskeleton. The exoskeleton is just on the outside. They're crunchy on the outside, soft on the inside. We are soft on the outside. Well, we are soft on the outside and hard on the inside. Everything you see on the outside of an insect is exoskeleton. It's great stuff. It doesn't decompose. It doesn't break down. I've looked at beetles in the British Museum in London that Darwin collected. They're 200 years old. They're brittle, but they don't decompose. So it's like a suit of armor. Very tough stuff. So this provides great protection for all of the arthropods. Think about a big old lobster. I mean, they're literally in a suit of armor. It can form different structures. So everything you see, the covering of the antenna, the covering over the eyes is transparent exoskeleton. All these little spurs, all these hairs, all of that is exoskeleton. It's a complex starch, a very, very complex starch. And if you soften the exoskeleton at different spots, you have joints. And this allows for flexibility and great range of motion. So it's a really, really great thing to have. Flight. What groups of animals have the power of true flight? Well, there's one. What?
Birds and mammals.
Birds, and which mammals?
Bats.
Bats, yeah. Birds, bats, and insects all have the power of true flight. Flying squirrels don't count. They're just falling in style. But these were the first ones to fly. They beat the birds by 150 million years. So what does flight get you?
Everything.
Yeah, everything. If you can fly from point A to point B, it's a lot faster than walking. So insects are using flight for finding food, for migrating, for finding mates. Some insects court and mate in the air. It's a great way to get around. It opens up the whole aerial niche as a means of travel for a lot of insects.
Can I ask a question?
Sure.
There's like memes or inspirational posters that say, something like it's physically impossible for bumblebees to fly if they do it. I think it's supposed to like inspire you to believe in something. But as a scientist, I have a hard time believing that it's physically impossible for a bumblebee to fly. What is that about?
That was, if I recall correctly, I read that years ago. I think a German physicist came up with that. But obviously, the bumblebees have proved him wrong. Physicists are not biologists. A lot of insects have very, very complex behaviors. So if you think about honeybees or a lot of the social insects, there's very sophisticated behaviors. How many people in here have GPS on their phone or in their vehicle? What does GPS tell you? What does it tell you?
Where I am.
Where you are. What else does it tell you?
What's around you?
What's around you? What else does it tell you? When you plug in Waze, where you go or your destination, it tells you where to go. It tells you how long it's going to take to get there. So honeybees, their brain is about the size of a grain of rice. They are not rocket scientists. But these worker bees and scout bees, they can go into their hive, they can forage, go back to their hive, and they can tell their nest mates, if you fly in this direction in relation to the sun for this far, you will find a food in this amount level of quality. So honeybees can communicate distance, direction, and food quality to their nest mates. Very, very, so they literally had GPS directions going on long before we even invented a GPS system.
How do they communicate?
With two types of dances. So they have what's called a circle dance.
I'm ready.
What does that look like?
Where's the hula hoop? They have a circle dance if the food is within a few hundred yards of the hive. The further dance is called the waggle dance. And I'm not going to waggle because I'm happily married and I know all the groupies will be swarming my inbox. The waggle dance is done in relation to the sun. Well, let me start over. A scout bee goes out and finds a patch of flowers it brings back nectar. So it drinks the nectar and stores it in the front part of the digestive system. And it has pollen on the body. And honey is just regurgitated nectar. So if you like honey, you like bee barf. It flies back to the hive. It will distribute that honey or that nectar, and the other bees can assess the quality, because not all nectar is the same. And then it will do its dance, and this is in relation to the sun. So, so if this screen is the honeycomb in the hive, it will dance in relation to the sun. So if the sun is up here, and the bee does a dance in this direction at this angle, that's telling the other bees when you leave the hive, fly at that angle in relation to the sun. And they also buzz their wings and they wag their abdomens. And that is the intensity and level is an indication of how much energy, which translates to distance. It's very sophisticated information that they're transferring for something with a little tiny brain. Carl von Frisch figured this out.
And this is a language that is inherent to the organism, not a language of the community.
I'm not sure what you're
Well,
asking.
like, if you take orcas, out of their pod, or whales,
right.
they have their own
Yeah,
language.
all bees do that. All honeybees do that. Yeah. So very sophisticated information. Ant ranchers. So a lot of hemiparins are true bugs like aphids, tree hoppers. There's a lot of different hoppers out there. As they're feeding, they're sucking up a lot of sap. And they shunt a lot of that out through their anal opening. It's basically sugar water. A lot of ants will use that as a source of food. It's a cheap and easy carbohydrate. But they treat, in this case, aphids. They're essentially like dairy cattle. So they will protect these aphids. So if a predator comes along, they'll drive the predator off. Some ants, they'll push the aphids, just like a dairy herd, to the younger parts of the plant that are faster growing. Some ants, they'll use their stinger and they'll lay a chemical fence around the aphids and keep them corralled in a little chemical barrier. So they're literally farming or treating their aphids like a dairy herd. Very sophisticated behavior. This is a jewel wasp. It finds a cockroach, it stings the cockroach and injects the venom, and that affects the cockroach's brain, and the cockroach becomes very docile. And this wasp can take it by its antenna and pull it and it leads it like a dog on a leash to the burrow, to the wasp's burrow. And then the cockroach is paralyzed, and the wasp lays its egg, and the wasp egg hatches and it eats the cockroach. Very sophisticated behaviors for things with very, very, very small brains. And this is the last one. Coevolution with flowering plants. There's often this question, did insects drive plant evolution or did plants drive insect evolution? And if you look at the geologic timetable, the really huge rise of insects coincides with the rise of angiosperms. It's really diversity driving diversity. There's a lot of coevolution that has taken place between plants and insects. So a lot of things have adapted to feed on pollen and nectar. And a lot of plants have evolved to depend on these pollinators for reproduction. A lot of insects have evolved to feed on plants, on the vegetation. The plants in turn have evolved chemical defenses that will deter or repel insects or even affect their reproduction. So some plants make chemicals that make the insects that eat them lay fewer eggs. They reduce the fecundity. In turn, insects have evolved chemical defenses or ways to handle the chemical defenses of the plants. So if you think about what kind of caterpillar is this? Monarch. So things like monarchs have evolved where they can take the plant chemicals that are defensive in nature and use them for their own purpose. So in the case of the monarchs, they're sequestering the cardiac glycosides in this butterfly weed, and that makes this a toxic insect that predators don't want to eat. So there's this constant arms race or coevolution where plants evolve a strategy, insects get around it, plants co-evolve a different strategy, insects get around it. You look at this Colorado potato beetle. Once again, it feeds on plants. It can use the defensive plant compounds as part of its defense, so it tastes bad. A lot of insects also use those plant chemicals to produce things like their pheromones or chemicals that they actually need for their life cycle. As I said, exoskeleton is great stuff. Suit of armor. So you have joints, you have a lot of protection. Everything on this beetle that you see is exoskeleton. And exoskeleton can be formed into just about anything you want. Who had a Play-Doh Fun Factory when they were a kid? Oh yeah, okay, 2 of us. Yeah, so you get all these preset dyes or forms, and you push the Play-Doh through it, and you can make all these different structures. You can do the exact same thing with exoskeleton. The business end of an insect, the mouth parts. So everything you see on this ground beetle is exoskeleton. These are the mouth parts. There's a lot going on up there. And if you dissected out all of these mouth parts, and these are called chewing mouth parts, these are the most common and least specialized kind of mouth parts insects have. You'll see there are 7 different pieces that are working together for this beetle to feed. Don't memorize all this. What I want you to know is mouth parts are a highly functional complex of pieces that have to work together. So if I dissected all these little parts out, you would see an upper lip called the labrum. You would see 2 mandibles that work in this direction. You would see 2 things called maxillae that are right behind the mandibles. You would see something called the labium, which would be like a lower lip. And hanging up in the middle is a little thing called the hypopharynx that's like a tongue. This is where the saliva gets dumped out. Actually, the salivary glands are in the thorax. So there's ducts that run up through the neck and the head to dump out saliva. So all these pieces have to work together for this insect to grab a meal and feed. So you might have this moving, you'll have these swinging in and out, you'll have these little finger-like extensions often have sensory organs on them, and they can handle and manipulate the food. So there's a lot of muscles working these. There's a lot of nerves that are innervating these. So this is a little film clip of a mantid eating. Oh, Jill, it's not going. There we go. So this mantid, here's the labrum, here's the these are the mandibles. Most predators like this, they just grab their prey and start eating it. So it's like death by 100 bites. Watch how quickly it takes care of this little prey item.
It looks like my brother.
No, that's me in the cinnamon roll. So we basically have a jaw and a tongue. And so this is 7 parts working together in a coordinated fashion to get a meal.
Do they ever bite themselves?
Not that I'm aware of. Like bite your tongue or your lip? No. Not that I'm aware of.
What is it eating?
It's some sort of true bug. It's not a stink bug. It's something close to a stink bug. It eats the whole thing.
Now, how long does it take to digest that?
Depends on the insect, depends on the prey. I would say probably a couple of hours from start to finish.
Does it have to eat so quickly because eating is a vulnerable activity?
I think they just like to eat. I mean, this is normal speed. This is not sped up.
Now, do they quit eating for a while, or are they just back to searching for something else?
It depends. So inside the body are stretch receptors. So if you think about a mosquito, how does a mosquito know to quit sucking blood or else it'll pop? So there are stretch receptors that will, when they're stretched, they'll tell the insect, okay, you're full. And we're done. Now we're going to do a little grooming.
He's getting the last drop.
Yeah. So now we're going to do a little manicure. So those are chewing mouth parts in action. But we're dealing with exoskeleton. We can form it into just about any shape that we want. It went forward. So you can take those basic chewing mouth parts that are very common. Think about grasshoppers, dragonflies, wasps, things like that. We can take that, we can leave the front part normal. So here's the mandibles on this bee. But of course, we know bees have a tongue. And we can stretch out the maxillae and the labium, those two back pieces, and form a tongue. And when a bee is not feeding, that's folded up behind the head. And when it's feeding, that swings down, and these are very flexible, and it can lap up nectar. These can be very long. This is an orchid bee. These can be, the tongue can be longer than the body. So this is the back set of the mouth parts that you find. So these are called chewing lapping. They can still chew with the mandibles, and they can pick up things and manipulate, but they can also lap with the back set of their mouth parts. This is a restrained bee. There's a little bit of honey, and you'll see the tongue swing out to start licking the honey on that little pipette. It's pretty cruel to tape a bee down with duct tape. Did you see that swing down? And there you can see it. So it's image is trying to feed with that long tongue. And then it folds it back up under the head. Swings it out, just like a dog tongue. Look how flexible it is. So that's a chewing, lapping set of mouth parts. Then we can stretch everything out, and we can have a piercing, sucking set of mouth parts. And you find these in sucking life. The true bugs, so these would be things like sting bugs, assassin bugs, aphids, and cicadas. Mosquitoes, fleas. So what we've basically done is we've left that front lip pretty intact. We've taken the mandibles and the maxillae, the next two sets, and stretched them out and locked them together to form a pair of tubes. And then the very back part is like the sheath of a sword or a scabbard. So when something that has this kind of mouth parts is feeding, it's inserting the mandibles and the maxillae into its food source, and these are called stylists. So in this case, this plant feeder is inserting the mandibles and the maxillae into this plant to suck the juices. The way that those four parts fit together that penetrate, there's two tubes. So there's a two-way flow. And when these types of insects are feeding, they're injecting saliva or other chemicals into the food source and through one of the tubes, and they're sucking the nutrient out through the other tube. So when this is feeding, there's a two-way flow. Show me on. So all these are penetrating their food source to feed and only taking in liquid nourishment. So here's an assassin bug. It's a predator. It's nailed this ant, so it jabs it with its mouth parts. In this case, it's injecting saliva and enzymes. These enzymes will liquefy the cells. And essentially, this is a can of soup at this point, and it's just sucking out the liquefied ant tissues. This is a giant water bug. It's nabbed a frog. It's got to be a very slow, painful death. Here's a plant feeder. So you can see it where it's fed previously. So it's got its mouth parts inserted. Some of these will target individual cells, or they'll tap into a xylem or a phloem vessel. Here's a bed bug. So this is a blood feeder, and you can see those little sets of mouth parts. In this case, it's injecting an anticoagulant. So when things like mosquitoes or bed bugs bite, the saliva and the chemicals they inject, that's what causes an allergic reaction. And you get that little red itchy spot. The piercing sucking groups are also very good at injecting pathogens, particularly mosquitoes. When you think about all the viruses and things like malaria. The champion are mosquitoes. When a mosquito is feeding, here's the labium, that's the back set of mouth parts. This is 7 pieces that fit together. This is 7 parts that penetrate the food source. This is the tips of the maxilla. This is magnified 7,500 times. This is magnified 2,000 times. So they essentially have a little set of a little saw that they can worm their way into the skin to feed. So they're injecting saliva, they're injecting anticoagulants through one tube, and through the other tube, they're sucking up the blood. This is a little video. It's a section of mouse skin cells. So these are mouse skin cells. These are capillaries. This is the tip of the mosquito looking for a blood meal. This is kind of creepy. So you can see how it's worming its way through the cells looking for a capillary. So just imagine this is you.
And then it pierces the capillary.
Like tapping a keg. There we go.
Whoa.
Gross.
So that is a great video.
Yeah, so obviously they have to search around to find the capillary. Very efficient feeders.
And that's in real time.
That was real time, yeah.
They're really moving around.
Yeah. Yeah. My wife can have 10 mosquitoes on her and she'll never feel them bite. I feel every single one. Yeah, so it all depends on the person, but yeah. So you can go the ultra simple route and just have essentially a soda straw or a set of siphoning mouth parts, and you find this in butterflies and moths. So when you look at a butterfly or moth that's not feeding, it essentially has a coiled up garden hose under its head. And when it feeds, it extends that and it can suck up nectar. And really, all this big long soda straw is just a little part of the maxillae, the part behind the mandibles, that have been very, very lengthened and fit together to form a tube. Everything else is gone. You don't see it in the adults at all. So there's a vestigial or absent. When you look at most flies, they have what are called sponging mouth parts. And typically you'll see a fly feeding on something liquid or moist. And if it's dry, they'll regurgitate saliva onto it and liquefy it. Because the very bottom parts of the mouth parts, the labium, is called a labellum. And it's like a sponge, and they will press that to the food source, and they will slurp in fluid or very, very tiny fine particles up into the mouth opening. So that's what, if a fly touches my food, man, I get rid of it. Because when they land, if they're on a piece of birthday cake or a piece of bread, they're regurgitating all over it to liquefy it so they can slurp it up. Man, I don't want that. So a lot of sponging things in the flies. And once again, this is all exoskeleton, all derived from the same set of chewing mouth parts. Who's been bitten by a horsefly or a deer fly? Yeah, those suckers hurt. And this is why they hurt. They're cutting you. These are cutting, sponging mouth parts. And if you look at the business end, you have these cutting edges, and they will slice the skin and let the blood pull up, and then they sponge it up. So they're slicing and then sponging up the blood. And of course, cattle and horses certainly don't like that. Wildlife doesn't like that. Yeah, these suckers hurt. And this is why the cutting parts are what are doing the painting. So how do we know all these are the same parts? If you look at a caterpillar, they have chewing mouth parts, just like our ground beetle, just like a grasshopper. Here's the labrum, the upper lip. Here's the mandibles with teeth, because caterpillars are typically chewing on vegetation. There's the other mouth parts behind. By the time it gets to the adult stage, and happens in the pupal stage, most of these parts are dissolved and disappear. And all that's left is this two parts that are back here on the caterpillar. There's also some very primitive moths that actually have mandibles. They have chewing mandibles. If you look at a mosquito, these have typical, and this is a mosquito larvae in the water. So these have chewing mouth parts. They're filter feeders. They just brush organic material into the mouth. All that changes during pupation into this adult set of piercing sucking mouth. So really, what this does is it means larvae and adults often have very different food sources and are found in different types of habitats or niches for their larval and adult lives. So if we take this grasshopper as our chewing mouth part, and these parts are color-coded, so all these are the same parts if they're the same color. So this would be a grasshopper or a beetle. We have our upper lip, we have our mandibles, maxillae, and labium. Leave this part intact, stretch these out, and you get a bee tongue. Take this in a caterpillar, lose most of it as the adult, stretch out these two parts right there, and you get a siphoning mouth part. Take all of this, stretch it out, lock them together, and you get the 7 stylets of a mosquito. So all these are the same parts, same mouth parts. They're just highly modified to feed on different types of food. And really what that means is that opens up a lot of different food sources to insects. All these modifications means insects can exploit a huge variety of food sources and become very, very successful at it.
So that kind of means that all insects evolved from the same first insect.
Right, right. There's a common ancestor to the insects. Yes. That's where I was going to take a break. Let's jump to wings. This is another reason insects are so successful as a group. All this is an outgrowth of the body wall. This is 2 layers of exoskeleton. That's all that is to form the insect wing. There's no muscles inside them. They're just 2 flats of exoskeleton. But they do a lot of things for insects. Mobility. It's much easier to fly from point A to point B than it is to walk. You know, if you're going to go to California, would you rather drive or fly if you're in a hurry? So insects use their wings for mobility, and this is great for finding food. They use it to find a mate. A lot of insects use their wings in courtship. A lot of insects mate in the air. So they're multi-use functions for wings besides flying. They can use them for thermal regulation. So things like honeybees, on a hot day, they'll line up outside of the hive and fan their wings to blow air through the hive. On cool mornings, you might find things like butterflies and dragonflies with their backs towards the sun. They're cold-blooded, so they're soaking up some solar radiation to raise their body temperatures before they can become really, really active. So the wings, good solar heat collectors. They can serve as a gill, particularly in aquatic beetles. So here's a diving beetle. These are diving beetles in the K-State Insect Zoo. You see that little bubble? They're folded up, and the openings, the breathing openings for the body are under the wings. So if the insect can trap air under the wings and keep that little bubble, this acts as a gill. Oxygen diffuses from the water into this bubble. And as long as it has that bubble and the air trapped under its wings, it can stay underwater. Yeah.
There's a question on the chat.
Yeah.
I want to know what the veins are in the wings.
Oh, what are the wing veins? So here's some wing veins. When the wings are developing, there's blood inside. Oh, let's see. I'll have to do cartoon arms. So if my wings are growing, top layer, here's the top of the wing, and here's the bottom of the wing. And the space inside has blood, and it has nerves, and it has air tubes for oxygen. And then when the wing is ready to become an adult, when the insect becomes an adult, it pulls the blood out, and those two top and bottom halves of exoskeleton collapse. So the veins are the air tubes and where the nerves were. So there's no blood in there. They do pump blood through the veins. So this is, it's hard to do without a diagram. So the veins are where are the tracks or the pathways of the air tubes and nerves when the wing was developing.
So they're a vestige.
They still have blood in them, they still have air, but this actual exoskeleton is not living. This is not living material. So as long as this bubble and this air, it knocks the bubble off and loses that air, it's got to go back up and do it. A lot of insects use their wings to produce sound. And here are crickets calling. Here's a tree cricket. This is a male. They rub the base of their wings together to produce sound. So wings can do more than just fly. Typically, these guys are males that are calling to a female, or they're defining their territory. And we'll talk about insect sound coming up. You can use them as a threat display. So if an insect feels threatened, you pop up, you look big, you look menacing. And this mantid is in its defensive posture. It's got its wings spread out, trying to look very intimidating to scare off a potential predator. This is the katydid. This is the back end. So when a predator comes up, it raises its wings, flaps them and flashes them. And you see all these eye spots and vivid colors, hopefully to scare off a predator. A lot of insects have eye spots on the wings. So a lot of moths do this. The wings are normally folded up. This is a lantern bug. And when a predator comes up, they open their wings. And suddenly the predator is looking at a face with big eyes. And this is called a startle display. So perhaps the predator will be intimidated and suddenly thinks there's something menacing instead of a potential meal. So a lot of different uses for wings. And they don't just do this. An insect could do this all day and not get anywhere. What they're really doing is twisting in a figure-8 motion to get the lift that they need. So if you look at the position of this dragonfly wing, this wing is like this. It's vertical up and down. So they're really twisting them in a figure-8 path to get the lift that they need. So this is a little clip. This is a great website, Ultra Slow. If you like to see like bullets going through watermelons, or there's a bunch of flying things, or a match igniting like at 5,000 frames per second. This is a cool site. So here's this is our bee example. The wings on this bee look extraordinarily small for this big chunky body. I'm not chunk shaming the bee, but this is a slow motion of a bee taking flight. And you'll see how the wings are going in this path. Who in here would like to be able to fly like that? That would be handy on a burn.
So that reminds me of like sculling when I'm in water, like
Right.
when I'm swimming and I'm just.
Right, yeah, same
And
thing.
so is it flying because it's literally just pushing air that's like those pushes are keeping it aloft? Or is that actually generating lift? And I'm
Yes.
sorry, you're.
Yeah, I'm not an aeronautical engineer.
Yeah.
I think what they're actually doing is producing like a vortex. If you've ever watched like a jet take off on a foggy day and then you see these swirly bits coming off the wingtip, I think they're probably producing a vortex that's providing the lift. It's not like an airplane wing where you have high pressure and low pressure because of the shape of the wings. So how fast are their wing feet? Dragonflies pretty slow, butterflies really slow. This is wing beats per second. Houseflies are pretty fast. Mosquitoes, when you hear that very high pitched, what you're hearing is almost 600 wing beats. This is per second. So imagine blinking your eyes, 600 times a second. Can't do it, but very, very fast. What does that translate to speed? They're not as fast as you think you are, as you think they might be. So dragonflies can cruise along at 18 miles an hour. Honeybees a little slower. Houseflies are actually pretty slow. People say houseflies are so fast, but they just look fast because they're small. If a hippopotamus flew across the room at 4 miles an hour, you would say, look at that slow hippopotamus. But if a fly did it, you would say, look how fast that fly is, just because it's a small object. Deer flies and horse flies are the fastest. They can top out in the mid-20s. And speaking of wing veins, they're very important depending on the insect for identifying what the insects are. So all of these veins have names. There's 5 main longitudinal veins in an insect wing. And they all have names, and every time they branch, they get a number or named differently. And these branching patterns and which wings are present or which veins are present or absent, very, very important for identifying different types of insects. Things like flies, Hymenoptera, very important in Lepidoptera, butterflies as well. So the take-home message on wings, hugely important in the life of an insect because it opens up so many niches and they do so many other things for insects just besides flying. Yeah.
So I've seen a monarch come out of the pupa, and it comes out in this little teeny blood ball. And as it sits there, its wings poop out. And my thought was that maybe they were pumping liquid into it
They
and then
are.
drawing it out.
They are, and we will get to that.
Oh.
We will get to that shortly. All right, just a quick word on the legs. Once again, these are made of exoskeleton, which means you can shape them any way that you want. This is the basic insect walking leg. This is the $10 biological term, cursorial. So this is a ground beetle, a tiger beetle. They're in the ground beetles now. This is the basic walker or runner. Tiger beetles are the fastest insects, walking or running insects. They can go at 5 miles an hour. And there's really nothing special about this leg, not modified in any way, but you see there are several different parts. Usain Bolt can run 27 miles per hour. This tiger beetle can go 120 body lengths per second when it's running. Usain Bolt goes 6 body lengths per second when he's running. So if you scaled this beetle up to the size of Usain Bolt, it would be running at over 400 miles an hour. Very, very fast. Some of these actually run faster than they can see. They're going so fast in relation to their body size. But this is what you find in most beetles. This is what you find on the front half of a grasshopper. This is what you would find in bees and wasps and things like that. Just the basic unmodified. This is the Chevy Impala of the insect leg. If you had driven an Impala, I apologize. But this is just your basic plain Jane unmodified leg. But it's exoskeleton. We can change it. You can stretch out what's typically the shortest segment, change the angle, stick some spikes on it. What's that a leg from? Yeah, that's a praying mantis leg. It's called a grasping leg or a raptorial leg because they can reach out and grasp their prey and trap it up against the body. This is just a slightly modified walking leg or cursorial leg. Anyone recognize that leg? Yeah, yeah. This is called a fossorial or a digging leg. So you can take that basic leg, that walking leg, make it really short, pack it with muscle, stick some big claws on the end, and you have a digging leg that's found in mole crickets. And these, of course, are tunneling through the ground. So essentially what you have is an earth-moving leg. So it's just a modified walking leg. You can change the proportions and totally change the function of that leg. Of course, you got your grasshopper leg. So this is a cursorial leg, This is a jumping or saltatorial leg. So you take the femur, you pack it with muscle. Basically, you have a big turkey drumstick. You change the orientation, and then you have this great jumping leg. And this little video clip shows grasshoppers jumping, and they're usually 2 or 3 body lengths above the surface before their wings spread for flight. Or you can have a swimming leg. This is your sculling. So a lot of aquatic insects have very long, slender legs, maybe some hairs on it. And you essentially have a rowing or natatorial leg. Look at that. I'm smart. No one ever calls me. So you take that leg, stretch it out, and make a swimming leg. Back to bees. So bees have cursorial legs, but they have a modified hind leg. And the very back has what's called the pollen basket. So when a bee is out foraging, you see all these pollen grains stuck on its body. And all these fringes and rakes and combs, it'll take its hind leg on this side, comb the pollen on this side of the body, pack it into a ball right here on the leg. And then it takes its other leg and combs the pollen off the other side and packs it on its leg on the other side. Of course, this is what they're using as a source of protein. So it can be modified to carry pollen. Yeah.
What is the name of that pollen ball? Is that a liquid?
I think that is a pollen group that's intact from the flower. I don't know if this has a special term. But I think like Bacteria or other plants, they have got like a ball, it's a package of pollen that sometimes will get stuck on insects. So just like our mouth parts, you can take a very basic plan and modify it to a lot of different very specific functions. So just like our chewy mouth parts, we have this very, very basic walking leg, like on this tiger beetle. If you stretch it out, make it long, you have this grasping leg of a mantid. If you make it very short and muscular and make big claws on it, you've got that digging leg of a mole cricket. This is a male diving beetle. They actually have suction cups, actual suction cups that they use to grasp the female while mating in the water. So once again, like the mouth parts, just change the proportions or the orientations of all these parts. All the color-coded parts are the same. They're the exact same structure, but highly modified to do different specific types of functions for moving around or making their living. So I've been singing the praises of exoskeleton, but everything is a compromise. And there are disadvantages to having an exoskeleton, and the big one is molting. So for an I said it's a suit of armor. So for an arthropod to grow in size, it's got to split and get out of that exoskeleton, and this is called molting. The animal is very, very vulnerable during molting. So here's a cicada molting. So here's the old exoskeleton that's coming out. Here's this new exoskeleton. It's totally vulnerable to any predator. It can't move. It's not mobile. It's stuck there until it gets out. The new exoskeleton is very pale and soft. It doesn't provide much protection. It will take some hours to harden and darken. And this is in reference to your monarch wing. Here are the wings. They're all crumpled and folded up. They're pleated. It's like a Japanese fan. So it can actually pump its blood and use it as a hydraulic fluid through the veins to inflate the wing to its full size. So all arthropods molt, so all the insects molt, spiders, ticks, scorpions molt, centipedes, millipedes, all the crustaceans molt. So think about a millipede with 100 legs. It's got to get every single leg out of that exoskeleton, or else it's going to be dragging it around and could become a meal. Think about a 10-pound lobster underwater molting. That would be a heck of an old exoskeleton. And you've probably all seen exoskeletons of cicadas sticking around on fences or trees. So all arthropods molt. This is the big disadvantage. You have to get out of that exoskeleton, and that's a very critical and vulnerable time. There's a lot of things that can go wrong, and anything can come along and eat this guy before it's finished. The other thing is the weight. The weight of the exoskeleton becomes a limiting factor. You would never see insects this size. Can anyone name the movie? This movie? Yeah, Them, 1954. You would never see insects this big because it's just a law of physics. You can double the muscle diameter and double the strength, but you increase the weight 3 times. So eventually, every time you double the muscles to carry this exoskeleton, you're increasing the weight 3 times. So eventually, the insects couldn't support themselves on land. Where do you see the biggest arthropods living? In the water, because the water can support the weight of that exoskeleton and those muscles. Put this guy on the ground, he's not going anywhere because he's too heavy, he can't support himself. But the density of the water can support the weight of these guys. So exoskeleton isn't perfect, but it's pretty darn good stuff.
So how do the shells get hard if they are doing molting underwater?
The crustaceans actually use calcium in theirs. The insects, there's a couple of hormones at play. One is called bursicon. It adds a protein called sclerotin. It's called, you sclerotize the exoskeleton, and that's when it gets hard. So exoskeleton, good stuff. Let's switch over to a little bit about what insects are experiencing. Insects have to get sensory input from their external and internal world, just like you and I. We have to know if it's hot, if it's cold, if there's food around, are we hungry, are we tired, what's going on in the world. And they have different types of receptors that provide that input. And they experience things that we don't. They can see things that we don't. They can taste and smell things that we don't. They can sense physical properties of their environment that we cannot. So a quick word about vision. Of course, you know, insects have compound eyes. This is a dragonfly. And they're called compound eyes because each of these little facets is an individual vision forming unit. And you put a lot of these together and you can see a lot of stuff. Here's a fly. Here's a SEM, scanning electron micrograph of a fly compound eye. Dragonflies can have 30,000 of these on their head. And of course, they're daytime hunters, but they have very, very good vision. So each of these can form an image.
Is it an image of the whole?
There used to be a little debate about that. The old theory was that, yeah, you would have like a mosaic of like 100 little images of, if I'm looking at you through my Ommatidium, my individual, I would see like 100 of you. But now the more current thinking is there's a mosaic, it's a more mosaic, kind of like, what's the style of painting, pointillism, where it's, you know, they're merged into one image, but it's not necessarily really super sharp. But what all those Ommatidia in the compound eyes do is they give excellent vision in many directions. They have what's called high flicker fusion frequency. That's hard to say, it's really fast. They literally can see faster than we can. So they can see 250 frames per second. So you go to the movies, you're sitting there pre-COVID, and you see continuous motion on the movie screen. We don't see each frame of the movie going by. Many insects could. They could see each individual frame scroll down the screen. So for humans, I forget if it's 30 or 60 frames per second, we see continuous motion. They're seeing much faster than we do. That means they can see motion really well. And they can see, particularly the flyers, really well. So this is a little video that shows, in a way, what a dragonfly sees, because they're daytime hunters. They're hunting very small things. They have excellent vision, so they're seeing much faster than we do. You might have.
This pea shooter might be low tech, but it's the perfect tool to recreate a high-speed target for our dragonfly. It fires out seeds so quickly, our eyes can't possibly see them. But is the dragonfly's vision quick enough to spot it?
We're going to have a look back at our slow motion clip.
Will the dragonfly detect the honeybee?
The dragonfly is completely still. And the head definitely turns before we see the seed come into frame. And then the dragonfly almost takes off, but it has enough time to assess that it's not a fly, and it changes its mind and stays on its perch. That's incredible. The head definitely moves first.
The dragonfly's vision is so quick, it can track the flying object and work out it's not prey, all in less than 0.05 of a second. It's partly due to the speed at which they process information. Dragonflies experience time in a completely different way to us. They have a reaction time of 30 milliseconds, far faster than ours. The whole process of seeing a fly simply take us to react in any way. But there's something even more astonishing about the dragonfly's vision. To demonstrate, Patrick has a flicker book.
If I flick this book fast enough, the images begin to animate. And that's because the pages are moving so fast we hardly notice them turning. It's essentially an optical illusion.
Although our vision appears to be seamless, our eyes actually work by capturing up to 60 images a second. Our brain then combines them to create the illusion of a continuous moving image. Because the pages are turning faster than that, it brings the animation to life.
To a dragonfly, however, this would look completely different.
The images would appear slowed down, and it would see each individual page turning.
And that's because dragonflies see faster than we do.
Whereas we see 60 images per second, they see around 200. And so they can observe things that are just too fast for even us to process. In real time, it's impossible for us to see exactly what this dragonfly is doing. Using our high-speed camera that slows down the action 80 times, we're able to reveal the astonishing accuracy of a dragonfly's vision as it catches a tiny midge in mid-air. Dragonflies have been around for 300 million years, since before the dinosaurs. In this time, they've fine-tuned their eyes to see their world in slow motion.
So what are they seeing? So colors, light, are part of the electromagnetic spectrum, which has frequencies. So the short wavelengths of light are ultraviolet. As the longer the wavelength of light, you go through the colors: violet, blue, green, a little orange. Humans see 400 to 750 nanometers wavelength, and 1 nanometer is 1 billionth of a meter. So we can see pretty much this range of colors. Insects see something different. They can see much shorter wavelengths of light. So they can see ultraviolet light, but they don't see into the red end of the light spectrum at all. So, back up one. So insects see color, but most of them don't see the same colors that we do. So if they're not seeing red, why are so many flowers red? They see blue-green, they see ultraviolet. They also can see polarized light very well. If you have polarized glasses, you see much better on very bright, shiny days. So if you look at something like a bee, this is what humans are seeing. And bees are seeing this part. So they're seeing different things. They're perceiving different parts of the environment compared to humans. So this flower in natural light, this is what we would see. If you look at this flower in natural light, this is what we could see. If a bee, since they see ultraviolet, if you photograph the exact same flowers in ultraviolet light, this is what in ultraviolet light, this is what they look like. They look completely different. And if you merge these two, this is what you get. So this is what insects like bees are actually seeing. And notice that the pattern of the flowers is completely different from what we see. So they're sensing very, very different things compared to us. A lot of insects are producing sound. So there's different mechanisms. A lot of them will rub the bases of their wings. They'll rub different body parts together to produce sound. So they'll buzz, they can stridulate. Some insects, they'll just throb their bodies against the substrate, and that's called drumming. So here's our crickets. They're rubbing their wings together to make noises. Crickets and katydids and the longhorn grasshoppers, these are the guys that are active at nighttime. They rub the base of the wings together. And here are the bases of the wings. This is called a scraper and a file. And this rubs over these ridges. So that's how they're making their noises when you hear the crickets and things calling at nighttime. The daytime grasshoppers, they are on the inside of this hind leg, there's a little series of pegs, and they rub those against the edge of their wing, and that's how they're producing their calls.
Are they communicating with those sounds?
Yes, they are. They're communicating. This is just an interesting tidbit. This is a tree cricket, and you often see tree crickets in a hole. Male tree crickets will chew a hole in a leaf and hang through it when they're rubbing their wings together. So this is actually an example of tool using by insects. So what noises do they make? Well, they have to hear the noises first. So a lot of insects have hearing structures on different parts of the body. They can be on the wings, they can be on the legs, they can be on the abdomen. This is a shorthorn grasshopper. These are the ones that are active in the daytime. I cut the wing off, but here's this eardrum. It's on the first segment of the abdomen. So this is just like our eardrum. Sound waves come in, They hit that. This is just a little thin piece of exoskeleton, like the head of a drum. It'll vibrate with the sound waves, and that triggers the nerves, so it can hear sound. Crickets, katydids, longhorn grasshoppers, their eardrum is actually on their front leg. So sound waves would come in, it hits that eardrum, it vibrates, and that triggers a nerve impulse up the leg to the brain. So a lot of different insects can hear. Mantids, a lot of orthopterans, cicadas, lacewings, a lot of moths. A lot of things are hearing things, and we don't always hear what they're saying. So sound is just vibrations in the air. And once again, this has frequencies or cycles per second. And these are called hertz. So sound comes in the range of 5 to 100,000 cycles per second or hertz. Above 20,000 hertz is ultrasound. We can't hear that. So humans typically hear from about 50 hertz to 20,000 hertz. This is the low, these are your deep bass sounds. So when a car pulls up next to you and its subwoofer is throbbing, those are the very, very low frequencies. That's the deep low sound. This is very high pitched sound. So humans, this is what we can hear. So if you look at, we'll get mammal for a minute. So bats, of course, are hunting at night. They're producing sounds for hunting that we can't hear. So moths, we can hear some of the moths, but moths are also making noises we can't hear without special equipment. Crickets making noises we cannot hear. Grasshoppers making noises that we cannot hear. So I'll play a couple of representative calls. These sounds are species specific. So one species is calling to another, and a member of that species will recognize that as a call from their species. So this is the snowy tree cricket. Here's the male. He's calling to a female. He's attracted one. And this is a 1 second block of time. So this whole bar is 2 seconds long. And you'll hear the call of the snowy tree cricket. If you watch Big Bang Theory, this is also the cricket. When Lewis Black, the comedian, played the entomologist, and the guys caught one of these, and they were trying to figure out what species it was. This was the cricket involved.
It really was a snowy tree.
Yeah.
Were you yelling at the TV?
No. But if you're at the movies, and whenever there's a night scene in a movie or a TV show, and you hear crickets calling at nighttime, this is the call they use. The sound engineers put that in for that nighttime ambiance. This is a katydid. They have a very different call. This is a series of 3 pulses. It's very, very distinct. I've heard this one in my backyard. All right, let's change something. There's a fall cricket, a different set of calls. And this is a Jamaican cricket. So just like ornithologists can go out and identify birds by their calls, guys who are women or entomologists can go out at night or in the daytime, they can recognize the species calls of all these different critters that are communicating with each other. And as I said, very often it's males that are calling to attract a female or defining a territory so other males won't encroach. This is a great website. It has tons of orthopteran calls, crickets, katydids from all around the world. It has photographs and the sounds and things like that. So this is a really cool website if you're into insect communication.
Do the distances that their calls can travel match an area that they could reasonably defend? Or is there some sort of understanding of like, okay, I know that you're far enough away that it doesn't make sense. for me
I
to
don't know the answer. Of course, the sound, I will say the sound carries much further than the insect can reasonably defend. But the loudest insect is a cicada in Australia. The loudest insect for its size is just a few millimeters long. It's an aquatic insect, but it can produce a call that's 100 decibels, which is about like standing next to a chainsaw. I'll mention moths, because there's a lot going on at nighttime. So of course, moths are active at nighttime, most moths. And who else is active at nighttime? Bats. And moths are prime prey item for bats. How do bats hunt? Yeah, echolocation, they're using sonar. So bats are broadcasting sound in pitch dark to locate their prey items. So many moths have eardrums on the body, and they can detect the sound of the bat's sonar as the bat is flying around hunting. And this allows them to take evasive action when the bat starts getting close. But even there's a lot of moths taste bad. They've incorporated the plants they feed on, the chemicals, and they taste bad. But how do you tell a bat that you taste bad in the dark? Before you get eaten. You broadcast your own noise. So many moths have a little structure. This is a 1 millimeter scale bar. The moths can broadcast their own sound back to the bat. They can tell the bat, I taste bad, don't try to eat me. Or they can actually jam the bat sonar, the bat signal, with their own counter noise. So it's a really cool evolutionary arms race that's going on here. There's a lot of YouTube videos available of bats, of moths dodging bats or jamming their sonar. The third level of coolness is there are moths that don't taste bad, that are perfectly palatable. They have evolved to mimic the sound of the inedible moths. So it's actually an acoustic mimicry where they're telling the bats, I don't taste bad, but I really do taste good. This will not be on the exam. Insects are masters at chemical detection. And when I say chemical detection, think of tasting as actually making contact with the substance, and smell as being airborne. And this usually involves some sort of opening in the exoskeleton. So this would be the exoskeleton, and there's usually a nerve. This is a nerve that's open to the environment in some way. So molecules of substances can make contact with that nerve and detect taste or smell, just like olfactory receptors in your nose or taste buds on your tongue. These are often on the antenna, the mouth parts, on the feet, or the egg-laying tool of the female. Chemicals often mediate insect behavior, and these chemicals will affect feeding, courtship, mating, where they live or where they lay their eggs, and a lot of other behaviors. They're masters at chemical detection. And I'll mention pheromones, because this is a primary means of chemical communication within a species. Now, I'll use a moth as an example. For many insects, when a female is ready to mate, she will release a chemical, pheromone. And a pheromone is just a chemical communication within a species. So she will release a chemical scent. Avon, whatever. Pick your cologne of choice. And this will drift downwind. And male moths have very elaborate antennae. And these are studded with nerves and sensilla that are designed to detect this chemical signature of the female. So a male moth, if he catches a scent of a female upwind, he'll trace that odor plume. So he'll fly out, he'll fly back into it. And as he gets closer, the concentration of the scent is stronger and stronger. So this is a long distance olfactory communication to draw a male into a female. It only works within a species. Other species won't detect that. So it's a great way to find a mate. Y'all probably know Valerie, right? She was helping a guy do a study on host races of the buck moth. Down here they feed on a particular plant, up north they feed on a different plant, and he was doing a little study. So Valerie collected a bunch of caterpillars last year and reared them to adulthood. And they're seeing what females, which fed on which plants attracted which males. So in this cage, there is one female buck moth. She hasn't mated, and she's ready to mate. She's producing her pheromone. And you'll see all the males that are drawn to the pheromone of that one single female in this cage. So all these are males that are drawn to the scent of this one female and her pheromones. Normally, she would find a male and mate, and that would be it.
Are those wild males or those?
Yeah. Has her spot. She's got her buck spot on. So the power of chemical communication, that's a great example. They're also detecting other things. A lot of insects detect heat or infrared, particularly the bloodsuckers. So in pitch dark, things like fleas, mosquitoes, and bedbugs, they can find you. They can smell your carbon dioxide you're exhaling. They can detect your body heat. So particularly if you're feeding on blood like a flea, you need that. This is a cool thing called a fire chaser beetle. They have infrared detectors on their body. They only lay their eggs in burned or smoldering wood. So they can find a forest fire from miles away or a campfire that someone left behind and lay their eggs in that burned wood. A lot of things are detecting different levels of moisture or humidity. A lot of things are detecting the magnetic field of the earth. How they're actually using that, we don't know, maybe for orientation or navigation, but they're sensing a lot of stuff that we are not. So here's a picture of Konza. Nice picture. There's so much information in this, insect information in this photo. There's insects communicating with each other. There's insect noises that we can't hear. There are insect chemicals floating through the air that we can't detect. There's a whole milieu of things and sensations and perceptions going on that insects are experiencing that we cannot. So the closest thing I can think of is, if we could see every invisible thing that we use, but we need instruments to perceive. So maybe this guy's gone on a gallon of Axe body spray. Maybe she's got Avon. If we could see every wireless signal, every cell phone signal, every Bluetooth signal, every radar wave, every microwave, ultraviolet, maybe this is what we would experience if we experienced everything that insects do, all those different sensations that are out there. So we looked at why insects are successful, how their body plans can be adapted to different things. We looked at what they're perceiving and some of the sensory things. So here's our picture of Konza again. What are the insects actually doing out there? They're pretty much doing what all the other animals are. So from an ecological standpoint, a lot of insects are herbivores. They're feeding on plants. And if you look at that picture at Konza, there are going to be insects at the bottom of the creek. They're going to be in the mud or the sand. They're going to be under the rocks. They're going to be on the rocks. They're going to be on the bark. They're going to be under the ground feeding. They're going to be up in the leaves feeding. They're going to be flying around. They're going to be walking around the ground. There could literally be 1 million insects in this photo doing all the things that most other animals are doing. So a lot of these are feeding on plants. Virtually every part of a plant can be fed on by an insect. The insects feed on roots. They feed under the bark, they feed on the bark, they feed on the leaves, they feed on the flowers, they're using nectar, they're using pollen. Some of them are so small, this is a leaf miner, they actually tunnel between the top and bottom layer of a leaf and slowly eat it. And you can see the progress this one has made as it's eating the leaf. They can cause wide scale plant damage. This is gypsy moth up in the northeastern part of the country where the caterpillars can defoliate large swaths of forest and trees. A lot of things are feeding on fruits, particularly as larvae. They can be very, very damaging that way. So a lot of herbivores out there, a lot of predators, and a lot of prey. A lot of things eat insects. Vertebrates, birds, lizards, amphibians, reptiles, mammals. A lot of those are eating insects. A lot of insects are eating other insects. So here's a ladybug larva eating an aphid, a ladybug adult eating a bug. You can actually buy buckets of ladybugs and stick them out in your garden as predators. Here's a wasp that has captured a caterpillar. This is a flower or hoverfly larva munching its way through aphid. So there's a lot of predation going on, and insects can actually control populations of their prey items in the right situation or the right setting. So you have predators and prey. You also get a lot of cool parasites. I love parasites. So here is a wasp. It's laying its egg in its aphid. The wasp egg hatches. The wasp larva eats the aphid from the inside, kills it, and if you've ever seen the movie Alien, then the adult pops out of the dead body of the aphid. This is some butterfly weed I had growing on my deck one year. It was infested with aphids, but all these brown puffy aphids have a wasp inside them that has killed it, and it's developing. Here's a tachinid fly laying its egg on this caterpillar. The fly egg will hatch, the larva will bore into the caterpillar and wind up eating it and killing it. The cool thing about parasites, depending on the species, is they'll eat the least important things first to keep the host alive as long as possible. So they'll eat like the muscles and the fat bodies and like say the nervous system for last. So they get every little bit of nourishment before they wind up killing the host. This wasp has 3 parasites living in its body. It won't kill the wasp, but it's going to screw up that wasp and it probably can't reproduce. So there's a lot of very interesting parasitic relationships in the insect world. And you can actually have parasites of parasites. So there are certain parasites that would come in, attack the wasp that's inside the aphid. So you have the host, a parasite, and then a hyperparasite that attacks the first parasite. So there's a lot of cool relationships there. You also have ectoparasites, particularly in the form of blood feeders or those that are feeding on flesh. So of course we're familiar with mosquitoes and things like black flies. A lot of these will also, in addition to taking a blood meal, they can vector diseases. So particularly things like mosquitoes can spread a number of diseases in wildlife and humans or our animals. Think about heartworms, think about West Nile virus, and things like that. There's a lot of things that will infest animal tissues, wildlife, livestock, or humans. What are these? Horse people. Yeah, horse spots. How tough do you have to be to spend part of your life in the guts of a horse? You got to be pretty tough to make your living that way.
What did you call those?
Horse bots, B-O-T-S. So there are a lot of things. There are bots. There's warbles. They tunnel around under the skin. They can damage meat and hides. This is a primary screwworm damage. A couple of years ago, there was an outbreak of screwworms in the Florida Keys, and about 135 deer had to be were either killed by the flies or had to be euthanized because the fly lays its eggs, and the larvae literally eat the animal alive. And a number of these deer were killed or had to be put down, and they had to control the flies. This is one of the primary pests that at ports of entry that the USDA is looking for in live animals, any sign of screwworms.
So that was an invasive species that came in from outside?
No, it actually was native. It caused huge livestock losses in this country. And in the 1950s, two guys figured out the female fly only mates once. So what they did was they started rearing these by the billions and irradiating them with cobalt. And that screwed the DNA of the males. So they couldn't produce fertile offspring. So the infertile males would mate with the females. And of course, she didn't know they were infertile. So starting in the 1950s and through the 60s, they started up about the level of Kansas and Missouri, releasing billions of these irradiated flies. It's called the sterile male technique. And gradually, if the population would sustain itself, and they gradually pushed it down through Oklahoma, down through Texas, down through Mexico. There's still a facility in Mexico that rears these, and there's one in, I believe, in Panama. So it was native to the U.S., but it's been eradicated. It's one of 5 insects that have been eradicated in the U.S., but it is still present in other parts of the world. So they really watch ports of entry for live animals having screwworms. Pollinators. Pollinators are very hot right now. And very prominent in the news for the last several years. Of course, a lot of these are bees, but they're also pollinators like moths and butterflies and particular flies. And of course, many pollinator plants are dependent on pollinators to reproduce. We are dependent on pollinators for a lot of the foods that we enjoy. There's a really bad meme, internet meme out there, attributed, I think, to Einstein. If the bees disappear, humans will starve to death. Well, that's just bunk. Because our primary grains, rice, corn, wheat, they're pollinated by wind. They don't really need it. But a lot of the stuff we do enjoy to eat do need pollinators, particularly bees, to pollinate them. And then, once again, I mentioned there's a lot of coevolution between pollinators and plants. Some pollinators are very specific. Maybe they'll use just a few species or one genus of plant. Others will use some. They don't care what they eat. But pollinators, hugely important. Getting a lot of attention due to pollinator decline. Which one of these is a bee and which one is not a bee? That is the question.
One's a fly.
But which one?
The bottom one's the fly.
Yeah, the bottom one is the fly. This is a flower fly, also known as the hoverfly. Great example of mimicry, and we don't have time to get into that, but mimicry and insect defenses are a great topic. So this is a honeybee. This gains protection by looking like a bee that a predator likely would not want to mess with. When I actually have live specimens, I think I have some out back there. Kids can usually tell the difference. Most adults can't tell the difference between the two, but kids are a little more clued in to the natural world. So I'll use yuccas and the yucca moth as a really tight example of plant-insect mutualism. Of course, this is the yucca plant. We have them here and there around here. But there are a couple of genera of moths that are the only insects that pollinate yucca plants. This is the male. This is the female. She's got some funky mouth parts. Kind of like that weird, these little weird tentacles on her mouth parts. But these are the only moths, these few genera, few species are the only moths that fertilize yucca plants. And when the flowers are opening, a female moth will move into a flower. She'll scrape up the pollen and form a pollen ball with these little weird mouth parts. Then she flies to a separate yucca plant and she'll lay her eggs in a different yucca flower. She fertilizes it. She takes that developed fruit, and the yucca caterpillar only feeds on the yucca seeds. She also leaves a chemical mark on that flower that tells other moths, this one's already been taken. I've already laid my eggs here. It's fertilized. Go find your own flower. So these organisms are totally dependent on each other at this point in time. This has been going on for 40 million years. If all these moths disappear, no other insects would fertilize the yucca plants. If the yucca plants disappear, there's no other larval food for the yucca moth caterpillars. So these two are actually dependent on each other for survival at this point. So a great example of mutualism and being dependent on each other. And you've probably seen in the media that there's colony collapse disorder in honeybees. A lot of pollinators have been declining. This has been going on for actually quite a number of years. There's a Bligerman panel from the National Academy of Sciences. Without getting into, there's multiple studies of insect decline in diversity, insect decline in numbers, and decline in pollinators. Not just insects, but also things like bats and other things that can pollinate. And we look at these are the four big things that stand out as the reasons given for declining pollinators. Climate change, change in habitat or destruction of habitat, chemicals, and introduced competitive species, which you could spend a whole day talking about just this one single topic, but we got to move on. So more about the ecological aspects. A lot of insects are adapted for aquatic or semi-aquatic life, and they're very important in aquatic ecosystems as predators, as prey for other insects, for fish, for amphibians, for reptiles. There are even aquatic caterpillars. Believe it or not, there's actually several hundred species of moths that are aquatic. This is a dragonfly nymph. Dragonflies and damselflies lay their eggs in the water. You can see the wings developing on the back. You can tell a dragonfly from a damselfly. Damselflies have three tails, and those are the gills. This is awesome. Dragonflies underwater breathe through their butts. So they actually breathe through their anal opening. So they have extra trachea or air tubes around their colon. And they open up, suck in the water, extract the oxygen. And if they're in a hurry, they can squeeze that water out and jet propel themselves in a hurry to get out of danger. These are mayfly nymphs. You can see wings. These are actually gills along the side. You can see the wings. These are caddisfly nymphs. And this is a dobsonfly, also known as a helgramite. You can see the gills along the body. Great aquatic predators, great fish food, and great fish bait also. So insects have a big role in aquatic ecosystems.
I have all of those in pink.
Yes, yes. I caught all of these in Wildcat Creek up on my side of town. And we can use that, use some of those groups as bioindicators where we can assess the levels of pollution in particularly different waterways. And there's a very standardized thing called EPT, which stands for Ephemeroptera, Plecoptera, and Trichoptera. Those are orders of insects. And species in those orders have known different tolerances to pollution. So things like Nature Conservancy, state agencies, federal agencies, they'll go in and sample waterways and look at what species of these groups are there. And based on their known tolerances to pollution, come up with an index of how healthy or how polluted that water is. So mayflies, here's the adults. You've probably seen mayflies at night. Here's a nymph. Here are the gills. Here are the wings developing. A lot of these can't take much acid or take a lot of chemical pollution in the water. These are stoneflies. There's the nymph. There's the adult. These are fairly primitive. These really need cool, oxygenated water. Cooler water holds more oxygen. For most insects in class, I say the closer you get to the tropics, the more diverse the group. For these guys, the further north or further towards the South Pole you go, these would get more diverse because the water is colder and they need cold water with a lot of oxygen. Here's a caddisfly. This looks like a moth. These are cousins to the Lepidoptera. So this is essentially an aquatic caterpillar. So by sampling for these particular species in these groups, you can assess how healthy a waterway is. And this is a standardized test, so you can make meaningful comparisons of any body of water anywhere in the world. Decomposers. Every time you drive by a dead deer on the highway, that's a huge source of food for insects. These are nature's garbage men. Dead animals, dung. There's a lot of energy, there's a lot of nutrients locked up in those carcasses and that poop or dead plants. So a lot of insects are using these for their own food or to feed their young. This is bison dung on Konza. These guys are probably just getting some water and salt. But dung beetles. Dung beetles are using that dung to lay their eggs in to make babies. This is a burying beetle. These will actually bury dead animals like rats and mice, lay their eggs on there, and then the young feed on the carcass under the ground. Termites, huge in recycling cellulose. They break that cellulose down. All of these guys are getting nutrients and energy back into an ecological flow. Nature's garbage. This was an article from Bioscience. A guy at Cornell did this. Ecosystem services. I throw that term out there so I look like I know what I'm saying. But he estimated that insects are contributing about $57 billion a year to the U.S. via removal of dung, pollinating plants, controlling harmful pests, and being food for wildlife. So huge impacts on the economy, not just the ecological situation out there.
So I have a question about dead animals.
Yeah.
Jill told me this a few years ago. Dead animal dies out in the middle of the desert, and within 2 days, it's full of maggots. Where do they come from? Out of the ground? Or are they in the animal?
The adults are very good at finding dead animals. Animal dies, animal plops some dung out there. Usually flies can be on that in a matter of minutes. And you haven't seen a fly anywhere. That's one reason why they're so valuable in forensic entomology, because they're really, really good at finding dead bodies. So a lot of mutualistic interactions, and I alluded to this earlier. The ant ranchers that tend to ants, they drive predators and parasites away. And this actually can interfere with biocontrol efforts. So there are cases in places like citrus groves in California where there's a harmful insect like aphids or scales. You bring in a predator or a parasite to control that herbivore, but you have to control the ants that are protecting the pest before you can use a predator or a parasite. And if you have watched A Bug's Life, the queen ant in A Bug's Life carried her little pet aphid around with her. So that's where that little pet aphid comes from ants tending aphids. Particularly skipper butterflies, Lycaenids, about 25% of those live with ants. The ants will tend them, that they produce a secretion much like honeydew. This is like crack cocaine for the ants. They love it, they lap it up. The ants get a meal, they get a high. These guys get protection because a lot of things won't mess with ants because ants are aggressive and they have stingers. There's a whole suite of different insects that live with ants. There are different beetles, there are different caterpillars, there's a lot of different things that live with ants, either as uninvited guests, or the ants tolerate them, or they actually mimic the ants. They have a chemical signature and the ants will actually feed them and take care of them, just like they were an ant in their own colony. So there's a lot of cool interactions that go on. I mentioned the plants and the insects, the evolutionary arms race that goes on, and how insects have evolved to use plant chemicals for their own purposes. A lot of plants will send off chemicals when they're attacked by herbivores. So there's a whole great set of chemical ecology things going on out there. So this is just a simple diagram you can grab out of any book. Certain herbivores come in, they start feeding on the plants. The plants will release chemicals that attract predators and parasites that will attack the herbivores that are feeding on them. So the ants are actually sending out, or the plants are sending out an SOS. Help, something is eating me. If you're this predator or this parasite, here's a handy meal for you. So there's all sorts of chemical things going on. So here's our Konza picture again. Besides the insect communication going on, there's chemical communication going on among the plants and the insects that are out there. So how do you collect these guys? Simple. Cheap net. There are specialized nets, special sweep nets. If you're going for little things, you can stick your head and suck up little tiny things. There's aquatic nets. A lot of things that come out at night are attracted to light or different wavelengths of light. So you can run black lights or mercury vapor lights and things like that. Set them up. A lot of things will come in that way. My technician is a Lepidopterist. Some things don't come out till 2 a.m. So when he goes out collecting at night, it's like, I'm not going out till 2 a.m. You know, some things don't pop out till 3 a.m. in the morning. That's when they're active, but he'll get them. You can use pan traps. Boom. These are just simple colored plastic bowls, solo cups and solo bowls. Different colors. You fill them with water and a little detergent to break the surface tension. And it's just a passive collecting thing. A lot of insects are attracted of these bowls. This is a grass Smithsonian now, a fly. So the wasp is attracted to the color and lands in the watery ground. These are bee bowls. So essentially these are mimicking flowers to collect and sample bees. You're pretty much limited by your imagination. Some people that work on Lepidoptera, they'll soak a piece of rope in some cheap wine, stretch it out, and the wine is an attractant to butterflies and moths. And I guess if you're bored, you can drink the wine or suck on the rope. For a lot of pests, there are pheromone traps. So particularly, this is a boll weevil trap. This is a fruit fly trap. So we can identify the chemical compound that makes up a pheromone for a particular species. And you can use that to monitor for pest populations, or if there's enough of them, if you put enough traps out, you can trap them and kill them out. This is useful for scouting for things like Oriental fruit fly, Mediterranean fruit fly, boll weevil. There's a lot of forest insects, wood-boring beetles that are attracted to different types of chemicals. Those can be used. Canopy fogging, stretch out some big sheets. You go down to the tropics, you know, where the trees are 100 feet tall and you can't get up there. You fog them with an insecticide and the dead things come raining down. Malaise funnels are good for surface dwelling things. You collect leaf litter for the top layer of soil. You put it on a screen and you put just a gentle heat. It's not the heat that dries them down, but as the soil or the leaf litter dries out, the insects will move down into a jar of alcohol. Great for collecting a billion things. Pitfall traps for things scurrying around, or carrion traps or dung traps. All these are useful for sampling different kinds of insects. And one of my favorites, the Malaise Trap. This is like a Texas Aggie tent with no wall. There's a panel here, and insects flying will hit this panel in the middle, and insects tend to move up when they hit an obstacle. So when they hit that panel, they move upwards and they're funneled into the head into a jar of alcohol. It's a great way to collect a lot of different insects. It's passive, it's out there 24 hours a day. So we run these out at Konza. I also put some yellow pan traps underneath to get stuff hopping around along the ground. This is over by Hokanson Homestead. These can suck up enormous amounts of insects. So this is one pan trap for 3 days out at Konza. This is what I caught out of that one pan trap for 3 days. For 3 days. And what I really want to point out is, yeah, there's a lot of big funky things like beetles and moths, but if you take all the big guys out, look at the biomass and look at the variety of things that are small. Much of the biodiversity in insects is going to be 5 millimeters or smaller. So I pulled out all the big stuff. All that was left was the flies. These are all the flies. So this is 3 days of one trap and the flies. And just, I don't know how many species are there. There's a lot of different, there's a huge amount of biodiversity just in that little bitty sample. I had an RE student one year. She ran Malaise traps and pan traps in 2 Konza watersheds, 2A and 20B. She was comparing sampling methods and colored bowls. So the Malaise traps, here's one, here's the other. 21 days of collected 13,104 Hymenopterans. That's just ants, bees, and wasps, 13,000 specimens. So that's not even counting beetles and butterflies and grasshoppers. So it's easy to suck up a huge number of insects in a sample. And if you ever start sampling, I say this to all the ecologists out there, you better appreciate how many insects you can collect and what it will take to identify and deal with a lot of specimens in any sort of survey work.
So I assume the 13,104 was counted by graduate students.
That was me, a grad student, and the RU student.
And you actually count them?
Yeah. Data, man, data. So how many species are there in Kansas or out on Konza? I have no earthly idea. We don't even know what's in our own backyard. There are checklists for Kansas for different groups, or for Konza, there's checklists for different groups. And usually it's the big things that are easy to collect and identify. So we pretty much what the grasshoppers are, a lot of the true bugs, a lot of the beetles, a lot of butterflies particularly. I think out at Konza we have about 60 species of butterflies and 38 species of grasshoppers. I mentioned my technician, he's a Lepidopterist. He's been collecting out here at Konza and in the northern Flint Hills for years. He's got 500 species of Noctuoidea, which is noctuids and a family called the Rebidae. It's a big group, but in the world of moths, it's not a huge group. There's 500 of these. So how many actual species are out there? As I said, we don't know. It's easy to find undescribed species. What does fire do to insects? It depends totally on the species. And for a lot of species, there's either no data or we really just have no idea what's going on. There are some species that have been pretty well studied, but it pretty much depends on the species you're looking at. So you see it's easy to find either big studies that look at multiple things or one particular group of insects or one particular group of insects in a habitat that is burned on a regular basis. So there's a lot of work going on with how does burning affect this species or this group of species or this group of species in this particular habitat. She likes regal fritillaries. Regal fritillaries, a lot of people are getting a little worried about them and their population numbers. So there is work going on with regal fritillaries. This is the range. Their host plants are violets, and violets are found in nice prairie. Very unusual for a Lepidoptera. They actually overwinter as larvae. And here's a first instar regal fritillary larvae. So they're going to be on violets. So they're out there, and if this happens, it's not very good for that little baby caterpillar that's out there. If it's a winter burn or a very, very early spring burn. You might recognize this name. So this was a study Beetle's husband just came out with, looking at the effects of fire on regal fritillaries. There's a lot of interesting things that go on. I think he found different sex ratios for males and females, and depending on the burn frequency.
The caterpillars can detect the oncoming fire, and they respond to it by scuttling under rocks, and they actually survive the fire by doing that.
Very good. I learned something. But really, to just make a general statement about insects and fire, the ones that would be most vulnerable to fire are those that are in remnant-dependent prairies are a lot of postage stamp size or very small prairies that may be burned and could, they would be exposed to fire. If they're on a rare host plant that winds up being burned, if they're exposed in a larval stage or low agility, if they're not mobile at that point in their life. If something happens like a summer burn, I guarantee there's going to be a lot of insects that are going to be burned to a crisp in something like a summer burn because they can't get away. They're an egg stage, a larval stage, or pupal stage, and they're not mobile yet. But really, to make a broad statement, there's not a lot known. There's a fair bit of information known for particular species, but that would take out a certain number of insects. What they're finding is patch burns, which is a little newer way of burning things like prairies. Patch burns provide different habitat, different layers and strata of plants. And what preliminary data shows is for bees, you get more number of bees, just individuals, compared to an annual burning, and you get a lot more species because the vegetation is more varied. So a lot of cool burn work going on with insects and pollinators. So to start winding down, what have you learned today? What I want you to know is there are more species of insects than any other animal on the planet. If you remember nothing else a week from now, remember that for the rest of your life. You might be on Jeopardy. That might be a Jeopardy question for you. And we looked at a number of reasons why insects are so successful. Small size, fast reproduction, exoskeleton that you can mold into any shape, any form, any function. Insects they're perceiving a lot of sensations, a lot of the physical world that we don't. It would be really cool to be an insect for 24 hours just to see what they're experiencing visually, chemically, acoustically. And they have so many roles in the ecosystem. They actually influence us every day with things like prices we pay for food. Huge effects on a number of ecological systems. And I like this quote. This is Tom Eisner. He's deceased now, but he's a very famous chemical ecologist. He said, insects won't inherit the earth. They already own it. And with that, we will finish with our little happy dance. Guys got some moves. Note the threat display, the raised wings, threat display. All right, that's enough of that silliness.